we're hearing from a colleague that I've known for a long time, and that's Dr. Kathryn McEachern. She's provided me one of my earliest volunteer opportunities on the Channel Islands, and that was volunteering for a plant survey. What year was that, Kathryn?
Well, 2002.
About
2002.
Okay. Look at that. It's almost 20 years ago. And that was a really neat opportunity. It was really interesting. It was a great survey.
Yeah, it was fun.
But Kathryn's bio is just too big for me to read here, but she's with the U.S. Geological Center's Western Ecological Services Center, Channel Islands Field Station. And she's been working on the islands for so many years, as I say, for at least 20 years. And she's also done amazing research work, and that's primarily that. Her job, of course, into restoration, including the effects of fog out on Santa Rosa Island. So maybe some of you folks who are joining us tonight volunteered for that project. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. McEachern. Kathryn, please take it away.
Okay, great. Let's see if I can get my, yeah, thanks for that intro, Ken. And it's amazing that we've known each other for 2 decades. Yeah. The time goes by, but I really would like to give a shout out to Channel Islands Restoration. A lot of the folks that hopefully some of you are watching tonight have helped me with rare plant work and rare plant recovery work over the last, gosh, 15, 20 years. And I just really enjoy working with you guys very much. I find that people who volunteer have kind of a gestalt about them that is really dedicated and forward thinking and very interesting and fun to be with. So I really do appreciate it. Let me see if I can give you some insights into how a scientist thinks about rare plants. And since it's Friday night and you're spending some of your Friday evening with me, I don't want to geek out on you too much here, but I would like to introduce you to some of the concepts in ecology that I have used in thinking about the rare plants on the islands. Like Ken said, I came here about, more than 20 years ago. I came here in 1993. And my job is as a research ecologist with the U.S. Geological Survey. Our function in the USGS is to provide research information that helps managers figure out what they've got going on their landscapes and what they can do about them. So it's kind of helping understanding and also helping develop some information about what to do. You probably all know where the Channel Islands are, but my work has been predominantly mostly on the northern islands that are part of Channel Islands National Park. But also there are other islands in the Southern California Bight where I've been working with botanists as well, and even recently down in Baja, California. And the landowners here collectively on these 8 US Channel Islands are now working together for conservation and preservation of the very amazingly unique landscapes and species assemblages that we have on the islands. And so I find it to be an incredible place to work. Besides the people that are incredible, the islands are too. And so here's kind of the big picture. One of the things that really drew me to thinking it would be great to work in the California area. We are right now in one of the hotspots of biodiversity in the world. You can see that in the northern continent, or the northern hemisphere, there's not a lot of that stuff on our continent. California is a really special place. And there are very, very many endemic species that exist only in California or in very small regions of California. And that really is an attractive situation for a rare plant botanist like me. So this is kind of putting it into context relating to the map there. You can see that there are about I don't know if you can see this, but there are about 280 individual taxa that are endemic to one or more of the California islands, of the 8 islands. That's a huge number if you look at endemism worldwide. This really is a very special place. If you look just at the native plant taxa of an island, about 10 to 30% of those on our islands are endemic. That means they are really our trust species to nurture and to cultivate and to conserve. If they go down on our watch, they go down worldwide. So it makes it working here quite interesting. And we need to remember, we have been interacting with these islands for thousands of years. The native peoples were here starting 11,000 years ago with, as I understand it from the archaeologists, with camps and then also with permanent dwellings on the islands until about the 1800s. Then the islands transitioned into a period of ranching, not just the islands, but all of Southern California provided wool and mutton and beef for the war efforts and for the mainland folks to eat. That was a period of about 200 years. This is a timeline of the animals that have been on the two of the biggest northern islands, Santa Rosa and Santa Cruz. There was about 2 centuries, 150 years to 2 centuries of animal presence here, ranching animals. And I came at a time when the islands are transitioning from ranches to conservation and recreation land use. And so it's been a really interesting time to be part of the transition, moving from one to the other. When I first came here in 1993, the Fish and Wildlife Service had been looking at listing plants of the islands, but they didn't have a really good handle on the conditions of the plants and where they were, how they were doing. And they said, okay, it would be great for you to put together a rare plant research program so we can kind of work together on recovery. And I thought, well, that'll be pretty easy because there's not much there. Look at that. This is a creek bottom, a canyon bottom on Santa Rosa Island about the time I came. I've been here a long time now, but it's really still difficult for me to wrap my mind around the profound change that these island landscapes have undergone, and likewise the nearby mainland through the ranching era. You look at this beautiful green landscape and you think of Ireland. People say it looks just like Ireland. Well, this landscape used to be covered with shrubbery mostly, and woodlands on the high peaks and in the riparian bottoms. And through the ranching era, it was converted from a scrub-dominated perennial system to a system that's dominated by mainly annual grasses. And all the things that go along with that include changes in pollinators, changes in the critters that live in the soil, changes in the biota that nourish the roots, the fungi and the bacteria. And so the system has been very fundamentally changed. And from the perspective of a rare plant, this can be quite a puzzle as to how to continue to persist over time in a situation like this. Here's a photograph of the ranching operations on Santa Rosa, which were managed very closely by cowboys and foremen to limit the overgrazing, but make sure that they were able to get a sustained yield off of the ranch. And so the cowboys would work very closely with the cattle. This is a scene from Verde Canyon in 1983. And here's the same canyon in 2014, just a few years after the last animals had been taken off. So sheep had been on this island in the 1800s, removed in the early 1900s, and then there had been deer and elk and pigs and cattle. These were all removed by about 2011, and the island has been reverting to a shrubland. So if you compare this to this over just a few decades, it really shows a lot of resilience. And for a long time before the animals were being removed, my feeling was, gosh, there's just not much hope. There's just not much left. But in fact, having been here and witnessed this makes me feel like there is so much hope for the islands, and there's so much resilience in these island systems that we can really work with them and take advantage of them and help the species come along. This is just another classic photo that probably a lot of you have seen if you've gone along the south side of Santa Cruz Island. There's a fence line that's going down the middle of the ridge in the foreground, and to the left of that is a really nice coastal sage scrub community. And to the right is an area that is still fairly barren grassland. What's going on here is that there are still sheep on the right-hand side. Sheep had been removed from the left-hand side for about 40 or 50 years. And incidentally, the study that Ken talked about at the beginning, we had a study plot right almost in the middle of that coastal sage scrub picture, and that was the only place on that island where we didn't find a non-native species. in our plot. Just saying. So in trying to wrap my mind around how am I going to run a rare plant research project, I just thought, what do we need to know? And so I have formed my research program for the last 20 years, are basically around these sort of pedantic sounding questions. Where are the rare plant taxa? How do they compare to how they were in the past? How are they doing now? And are there major threats that we can do something about? To start all of this off, I and the Park Service helped me put together a workshop. We got together about 20 local botanical experts, and we had just 2 days of brainstorming about who are the rare plant taxa and why do we think they're rare? Are they rare because we've seen them decline in our lifetime? Or are they rare because they just are habitat specialists and there's not much of that kind of territory around here? Are they rare because of certain ranch animal interactions? Came up with a list of about 100. And then that was my working list. My marching orders were to figure this stuff out. So I started by going to herbaria, particularly the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden and Rancho Santa Ana, but also places like the Peabody Museum and UC Berkeley, just to find specimens that had labels on them that would describe where these plants were and what their habitats were like, and generally when they might be flowering, because a lot of times they're easier to find when they're flowering. So having compiled that in the days before big databases, this is all compiled onto USGS topo maps with sticky dots on them to begin with, and it's now morphed into a spatial geodatabase. But armed with that information and with some grant money from the USGS, started doing field surveys, just going to find these populations, going back to see, are they still there? And how are they doing? And by doing that, I was able to say, looks like about 2/3 of the populations that were there in the early 1900s were still there. But how they're doing was hard to tell because a lot of times the people who collected the specimens didn't write down there are 150 plants here and they look good or they look bad. So the part of the program is to go back periodically to those populations, or at least to most of them, and do a repeat count to see, do we have more plants? Do we have fewer plants? Do we have plants that are reproducing or not? Some of those repeat counts produced some puzzles. And for about a handful of species, I started doing demographic monitoring, which is a really fairly time-consuming, painstaking piece of work, where you put out a plot on the ground, you map or tag every individual in that plot, and you're following individuals through their lifetime. And you're doing this to find out how long do they live? Do they have flowers? Do they have seeds? Do they make babies? Do the babies survive? In general, how is the population doing? Are we getting more and more plants all the time, or fewer and fewer, or is it pretty stable? And sometimes through that monitoring, we can figure out certain things that may be going on that might be an issue or a problem, and then we can focus in on experiments to figure out what exactly that is. So here's how I think about our situation with rare plants, or actually with any plants on the islands. We have the current situation, which is few populations, small and isolated and declining populations, particularly back when I first started in the Fish and Wildlife was looking at listing species and which ones really were in the worst case. And we want them to be many and large and connected and growing. And there are certain things that are preventing that from happening. I just think of those as constraints on population growth. The question is, what are those constraints? And how do we understand them and how do we work with them for recovery and conservation? And so I'm going to show you this. This is the punchline of my whole talk right here. But we'll come back to this. But I want to show you kind of where I'm headed with what I'm going to tell you about. So constraints can exist at a number of different ecological levels of organization. This is what we study a lot in ecology, is levels of organization. So on one hand, you have populations. These are collections of interacting individuals in a local area that are exchanging genes through pollen flow and having seedlings that are genetically diverse. And then we have the area of habitats. So habitats are the places that these populations live in. And I think a lot of CIR work is oriented toward habitat management. because it takes a lot of work to do this stuff. But when it comes to habitats, we think of things like, who are the other plants that are in the area? What are the soils like? Are they in a particularly like north-facing slopes only, or riparian areas? So what's the conditions like in their local area? And then there are people who make their entire career looking at landscape ecology. And here, what we're looking at is, how are these habitats and populations distributed across the landscape? Are they few and far between? Or are they large and connected? What are the dynamics that could interact, or could happen interacting among populations on the landscape? And then we talk about ecosystems and ecosystem processes. So with ecosystem ecology, we're looking at how are materials and energies flowing through different parts of the organization there on the landscape? How is water flowing into the system, through the plants, into the ground, and out into the springs and seeps? How are nutrients affecting plant growth that then affects other aspects of other plants in the communities? So there are a lot of different ways to look at why a plant is where it is, and for that matter, why we are where we are. And there are ways to look at that and think about it, and then match up the recovery tool at the level of the level of the constraint. One of the biggest things that people were saying in that very first meeting that we had, and that Congress knew when they made the national park, for example, and the other land managers know too, is that animal eradication, moving the livestock from the ranching era off of the islands, would be the first thing that would need to be done to facilitate conservation. And if the managers had done nothing else but that, I think that still would be a huge, or was a huge benefit to the islands, as we'll see. So what I'd like to do is show you just a few scenarios of how some of the rare plants that I've been working with are reacting to this animal removal, which was the biggest constraint that prevented us from doing many of the other things on our recovery tools list. A lot of these things on the list were difficult to do, were almost impossible to do while animals were around, because they would be disturbed by the animals. But now that the animals are gone, we can start to see the plants rebound, hopefully. And if not, we can start to ask, why is that happening, and what can we do? So I'd like to just tell you about a few plants on Santa Rosa and Santa Cruz as an introduction to this kind of thinking. So one of the three scenarios I'd like to tell you about is a joyful situation where there are a number of plants who are undergoing what we call passive recovery. That is, simply removing the animals is allowing their populations to grow. So they're able to make seeds and seedlings and spread in the environment. And one of the iconic species that's doing this, that is such a delight to see, is the Torrey pine on Santa Rosa Island. So the constraints model was leading us to think that certainly herbivory and trampling were cutting off population growth on that tree species, and that animal eradication should help it recover. And in fact, it certainly has. Here's a picture from 1942 that was taken by an archaeologist back in the day, looking, and then the same scene in 2012, and you can see that there's just been a huge amount of spread from that nexus, that small population outward. We had some CSU Channel Islands capstone students work with me to actually go hug every Torrey pine tree about 5 years ago, measure its girth, take some cores, and figure out what the ages are. And this is a map that they produced. The red dots are Torrey pines that are big, probably 100 years, couple hundred years old. And the yellow dots are ones that are small, that have come in very recently. And you can just see from this mapping that there's this sort of radiation of Torrey pines out from that kind of refugium stand that had persisted through the grazing days. And we are constantly cycling back and redoing this study every 4 years, and I expect we'll be seeing lots and lots more yellow dots. Another really cool project was back in 1994, got some funding to survey canyons on Santa Rosa Island, looking for rare plants for our list of 100. And we mapped them, and then we had an NSF grant that allowed us to go back in 2010, 11, and 12 and redo that, remap them using the same methods. And we found that actually there are quite a few species that are coming back on their own in those canyons as well. So for example, in 1994, Hoya Vieja Canyon had 11 species in it. In 2010, it had 17. And not only had the number of species increased, but the footprint of those rare plants had gotten much bigger as well. So this is an example of just the animal eradication alone being a really good move on the part of the Park Service in this case, and the other land managers in the other cases. Another really interesting situation that I guess I had not really thought of until I started studying it is that there are some species that benefit from open patches in the chaparral. Here's a picture of Santa Rosa Island chaparral in the foreground, and it's been sort of denuded or replaced by grassland in the background. But in the foreground, you can see that there are kind of open patches in the chaparral. The chaparral is starting to knit together. And this provides some interesting opportunities. So here's one of the species that island botanists really like a lot. This is island Jepsonia. It's endemic to the islands, but a couple of spots also on the mainland. You find it down also in the Baja Islands. This is a species that was a bit of a puzzle, very rare in the environment, patchy where it occurred. So we actually put out some demography plots. And here's Dieter Wilken showing us how demography works. You get down on your hands and knees and you measure on a kind of a grid system. This plant is 15 centimeters over and 20 down, and you take its measurements. You say how big it is. You say how many flowers it has, and you look to see how many fruits it's making, and you come back. And what this plant was telling us was that it really likes openness. And it was really kind of it was sort of a no-brainer, really, if you look at this picture. The top left is a picture of pig rototilling in its habitat. This plant has very juicy corms, sort of like a potato almost. The plant in the bottom left is probably going on 30 years old, but the pigs would dig it up and eat it. And you can see that that's not good. The bottom right photo shows that same view about 10 years later, after the pigs had been gone for about 5 years. And so you can see the landscape is healing up, the rototilling is going away, the scarring from it is disappearing. But also what's happening in our plots now is that with the recovery of the shrubs, we're getting a lot of shrub leaf litter. And this plant does not do well where there's a lot of deep litter. You can see one plant in the bottom left corner of that plot, but this plot used to have about 25 plants in it. The seedlings have trouble coming up through the litter. And so we've taken one constraint away, the animals, and now we're seeing that recovery is creating another constraint here. And so it'll be an interesting journey to see what happens with this plant. There undoubtedly are going to be areas that are going to remain open in the chaparral where the plant can find places to grow. An option also would be some kind of habitat management that seeks to create open spaces. And so we can do experiments to see if that's going to work as well. Another kind of set of species that I find to be really fascinating and somewhat complex to think about are species that seem to be constrained by changed ecosystem processes, so changed water regimes, changed biota that interact with them. And so I'd like to tell you about a few of those because I think you'll find this interesting, and also some of you have helped me work on these species as well. This is one that Ken mentioned, the island oak, Quercus tomentella. It lives only on the islands in California, but we also find it on Guadalupe Island, way far south in Baja. And you can look at its list of constraints that we have figured out by monitoring it, by surveying it, counting plants, looking at seedlings and stuff, that it seems to be suffering from a variety of things. Altered tree canopy or understory canopy, erosion, the lack of a seed bed at the habitat level, at the landscape level, populations that are far away, isolated from one another, and at the ecosystem level, trampling and herbivory. And we have some tools that can help with these things. Habitat management, the establishment of new populations. And to me, all of these constraints roll up to the fact that these plants need to be in the foggy zone where there's fog drip. This is a picture of the Soledad Ridge out on Santa Rosa Island. These are about a dozen island oaks that in real life, for back in the day, probably were a grove of oaks that were sticking up out of a continuous canopy of island chaparral. So they would be what we call emergent woodland in an otherwise chaparral community. When the fog rolls in, as it does every day in the summer, and those of you who've worked out there, you know, it gets cold and windy and the fog's coming in, it condenses on the leaves and twigs of these trees and drips to the ground, and normally would fall on the chaparral underneath and on the thick litter and soil layer that the chaparral have under them, and soak into the ground and nourish the roots of all the trees there. Also nourish the seedlings of all of these plants that are in that litter layer and trying to grow, and soak into the ground and get into the groundwater and come out as springs and seeps lower in the landscape. But you can see in this photo that instead of doing that, the water is hitting this bedrock and is running off and is lost to the system. And so in thinking about what we need to do for these trees and this habitat and this island ridge is we need to somehow be able to capture the fog so that we can start to have these plants hopefully recover more on their own. One of the problems there is there has been some extreme erosion at the top of the island. The wind is fierce there and it blows whatever loose soil there is. And then when we get rain, it washes away. And so some of the trees up there are on these, what we call stilt roots. Their roots are exposed about a meter, maybe 1.5 meters above the ground. And they're growing on what the geologists tell me is the sea horizon bedrock. That is the bedrock that was under the lowest layers of soil. And so it's an interesting system to work with and to think, what are we going to do? How can we help this system recover? And so taking a cue from some of our Chilean and Peruvian colleagues who use fog screens to harvest water for agriculture and for drinking water, and just the observation that things drip up there when there's structure, we have devised a couple of techniques that we're working with right now in a cloud forest restoration project. The goal of the project is to slow the movement of wind and water across the landscape, let organic matter accumulate, put plants out there that can then start to stick up and have their leaves and twigs capture fog. And to do this, we have done a lot of hard work, which I really appreciate you guys helping me with. Put out wattles on the landscape to slow the flow of materials across the surface. We've put out what we've been calling litter fences or zigzag fences that you can see in the lower left there. These are fences that are about 15 inches tall that are just trapping leaves as they blow by, and they're working very well. And one of the more fun things are these fog screens that you can see in the top left there. These fog screens are panels of galvanized steel 1/4-inch mesh wire with shade cloth put over them so that when the wind blows through with fog-laden wind, it'll hit that shade cloth and screen and fall down to the ground rather than just blowing by. And you can see in this picture, we had put this screen up the day before. We came back the next morning and there's water pooling at the bottom of that screen. And so our practice with those screens is to then plant plants at the bottom of those screens. And some of them we've actually also put on drip irrigation to kind of help things get started faster. But this technique seems to be working pretty well. This is a picture that I took, oh gosh, about a year ago. And things are looking up over there. We are leaving the fog screens in place until the plants get tall enough to harvest water on their own. And then we pick them up and move them and use them somewhere else. So it's a constant changing, revolving, evolving project. One of the species that's doing really well for us right now is bishop pines. They really, really collect a lot of water and drip a ton of water to the ground. So I think they're going to be kind of our workhorses up there. Another species that we've been working with for quite a while, actually started with TNC's Rob Klinger and Deidre Wilkin at the Bach Garden, is the island bush mallow. This plant is endemic to Santa Cruz only. It has relatives on the mainland that look a lot like it. And if you've been in the hills around Ojai, you've seen this relative growing back. This is a fire follower plant. It pumps out seeds. The seeds lie dormant in the soil until a fire comes and burns off the overhanging vegetation and it grows back. It's also possible, and it's a phenomenon that's been looked at on island plants, that this extreme need for fire, for many of them, has been relaxed a bit so that they'll actually grow if there's an opening and the soil gets hot. And so one of the things that we're working with is to try and figure out that dynamic. Does it really need to have fire, or can it have an open space? Does it need to have soil disturbance a little bit to kind of rough up the seed? So we're working with a lot of different aspects of this plant. But when I first started working out with this species on Santa Cruz Island, we only knew of 3 populations that were in existence. We've since then, with TNC's help, have found 3 more. So there's 6 native populations now. This plant is very strongly clonal. It sprouts like crazy from its roots. And so it's robust, and it really grows quickly if it has the chance to do that. But part of the problem is that there were so few plants, very low genetic diversity, poor to no seed production from those plants. When the seeds were made, they had very low viability. That means they didn't germinate. A very low percentage of them germinated. There were so few populations that they're spread kilometers apart, and so they can't cross-pollinate. And we found out that through some experiments that they do need to be cross-pollinated from other populations in order to make good seeds. And one of the biggest challenges for them is the loss of pollinators. That can't find them. They're so rare in the landscape and so far apart that the pollinators are having trouble finding them. So there are a number of different constraints for this species that exist at population and landscape and ecosystem level of organization. And the recovery plan that we put together with Fish and Wildlife Services says, you know what you need? You need more of this on the landscape. You need more populations in order to help overcome some of these constraints that go along with being too far apart to be pollinated. So with Growing Solutions, Karen Flagg and Don Hartley's organization, we started a long-term project trying to figure out how to grow this plant from cuttings. We also tried to grow it from seeds, and that's how we found out that there's very low seed viability. So we were mostly making plants from cuttings for this species over the last decade. We would grow them in an island nursery up to about a gallon pot size, and then plant them out on drip irrigation. And it's a robust plant. It grows very well in that situation. So it's a happy story because it's kind of a willing participant in its own recovery. This is kind of what it looks like. Here's a volunteer planting some plants out on the isthmus area of Santa Cruz Island. We have gone now from 6 natural populations to 4. We've added 14 new populations scattered across the island, and about 350 new plants. It's fun work too, by the way. So this is kind of what the population scatter looks like right now out on Santa Cruz Island. But like I said, one of the things that we noticed when we were trying to figure out how to grow the plant was that the seeds had very low viability. And so this last summer, I was able to go out with a group of people, a group of teachers, science teachers from the STAR program, who've been working with me on rare plant issues for the last 3 or 4 years, to look at the populations that we planted and collect seeds from them. And so the seeds are now in seed packets. We've been cleaning them, and we're going to be starting some germination experiments to see if, when we plant plants in a recovery planting from different populations, allowing different individuals to outcross or to pollinate one another, do we actually get better viability? And could we actually turn to harvesting seeds and planting seeds rather than having to go through this long process of growing plants in the nursery? So the last few plants that I've been telling you about are perennials. They have long-lived root systems. They persist as individuals for decades, if not hundreds of years. But I'd like to turn now to one species that really illustrates a lot of what are rare species of concern throughout Southern California. There are many of these annual plants on our Channel Islands and all down the coast, all the way through Baja, that have a very similar biology to this species here, island Phacelia. This is an annual that grows from a seed, germinates with the first soaking rains of the season, puts down a root very rapidly, and then grows upward over the course of about a month or 2 months, flowers, and then dies. But in that process, makes a lot of fruits and a lot of seeds, puts those into the seed bank, and the process can go on over again. But here we have an interesting situation where I'll show you our monitoring. Yeah, so we've been studying these plants in plots that are about the size of football fields out on Santa Rosa Island. We have 4 of these plots, and you can see that it's a very challenging job. That's a tiny, tiny plant. And this is an area that was lupin scrub, most likely, an open understory with a lot of native annuals back in the day. But through the grazing regime, it was converted to a spread of what's called ripgut brome. It's a brome grass that animals don't like to eat. They avoid it and eat the other things in the environment. And the consequence is you get this just big cover of brome grass, really thick. And so the tiny little Phacelia is dealing with this situation when it's not the situation that it evolved in. So we were interested to figure out what its dynamics are, and every March, just got back from doing this last week, we crawl through these plots looking for these tiny little plants. And here's the data that we've gotten from these plots over the years. One of our plots we only started in 2012, but you can see that the counts are all over the place. Generally they're low, but there are these huge spikes as well. Some years are just boom years. And this is the kind of ecology that we call boom and bust type demographics. There are very many years where not without very many plants, but then there are good years that things just go crazy and you get thousands of plants. And so how do you deal with this as a manager? You know, I mean, I've only been here 20 years and this is what I've seen, just a couple of good boom years. It's difficult to think of a plant that's mostly there as seeds in the seed bank that every now and then germinate. And so we got an NSF grant to figure out what is it that's making it germinate? What's it waiting for? You know, what's it doing all those years when it's, you know, when it's not coming up? So we figured there are a couple of things that are going on. One is we wanted to look at the dynamics of the competition with the brome grass. And the other is we wanted to see what kind of weather pattern stimulates the germination. So we fabricated these 1 meter square rainout shelters, carried them on our backs out to Carrington Point and a couple of other places, and cleared plots in there and planted about 150 seeds of Phacelia under about 50 of these structures. And then we watered them with different kinds of drought cycles. And so we started with, we had situations where we had all season drought, no drought, early drought, late drought. And we did this in plots that we had cleared of the brome grass and not cleared of the brome grass. And what was abundantly clear, not to make a pun, but what was really, really apparent was that no matter what made this plant germinate, when it came up and tried to deal with that brome grass, it couldn't make it. So the uncleared plots are the black bars there, and you can see there's just this huge failure of those plants to be able to grow up to a size that they can produce seeds and put seeds in the seed bank. So the consequences of this are that in these boom years, normally you would have probably millions of seeds going into the seed bank, into the soil. But here they've come up and they have been unable to make seeds. And so every time this happens, you have this slow and inexorable depletion of the seed bank. And so species like this, generally, that have been studied here on the Channel Islands and other places, are in this kind of slow decline because of the rarity of the event that makes them germinate, but the fact that they have to deal with this grass when they do germinate and are not able to make seeds. So one of the things that, you know, is not rocket science is let's see if we can thin the grass. Let's see if we can change that dynamic so that in those good years, you do get a lot of seed. And so we did an experiment where we mowed and raked lanes where we had seen Phacelia before. And I think this is a picture of some of you CAR folks. I think Kevin Thompson is even in that photo. To see if we could, just by that manual manipulation of the grass and the grass thatch, if we could get better germination of the Phacelia. And sadly, that did not work well. This was a one-time treatment, and the brome grass was so aggressive that it grew back the next year, and really we had no lasting or no big effect on the Phacelia from that treatment. And so I think what this says to us is that the clearing is obviously important from our NSF small experiments, but how do we parlay that to a big land management treatment? And my takeaway message from this is that if we do something like this, we need to do it on a sustained basis. We can't just do a one-off year and see if that helps, because the brome will come back. And we need to do it in large areas so that there's not brome grass on the sides of the areas that we clear that's seeding in. So research take-home messages: work harder. So those are just some examples of a few kinds of plants that are telling me stories about how they are responding to the changes in the environment, both the changes that were wrought by the ranching era, but also the changes that are now in play with the removal of the animals. And it's an ongoing saga. And every time I do more sampling, I want to know more. So just to recap, this is kind of my mental model of how this is all working. We know now from a lot of the research that we've done what some of the constraints are and how perhaps we can put those together. So here are just kind of a rundown, a list of what I'm calling the constraints that I found out through research and that others have as well. At the population level, many populations still have very few plants, so very few individuals, poor seed production, low seed viability, and therefore low recruitment. By recruitment, we mean not only seedlings being established, but growing to make their own seeds and fruits. We also, as you probably know from your CIR work, have constraints at the habitat level. Competition from invasives like the brome grass and the Phacelia canopy that's either too thick because it's an invasive grass, or too thin because the overstory shrubs have died off. And for an awful lot of our islands, no seed bed. And when I say seed bed, I mean that thick layer of soil and duff and litter that houses a seed when it falls down off of its parent plant, and keeps it in a place where it can be moist and shaded and protected from the elements, and kept right there on site rather than rolling down the hill into the ocean. At the landscape level, we still have a lot of populations that are highly isolated. Some of them, their habitat has just been lost almost entirely. And the other, one of our biggest, we had a botanist brainstorming session a few years ago at one of our seminars, and we all kind of centrated and came down to the fact that a lot of the habitats are highly fragmented. So fragmentation means that there are large patches between the habitats that are not close enough together for the seeds to go across them, or for the pollen to fly across them. And you hear this a lot with animals too, like island night lizards, or some small organisms that have to crawl across patches that are now no longer habitat. So fragmentation is a big deal. And then at the ecosystem level, pollinator limitation, a fancy word for the bees and butterflies can't find the plants. Herbivory and trampling, which is now not a bad constraint. Erosion, continuing erosion, is certainly an ongoing constraint. And then the wild card in all of this, of course, is the changing climate. And how do all of these things interplay as we get storms, precipitation storms that are more irregular but more violent, and warming temperatures. So it's quite a list, but it's a list that you can kind of grasp onto and say, all right, we got few plants, let's make more. We got low seed viability, let's do what we need to do to help these plants come along. And so these are some of the tools that we are now using to help recover some of these populations. So seed increase, we get seeds from the wild plants, take them into the nursery and grow them, make them big and buff, and get a lot of seeds from those plants that we can then take back to the island. Seed banking, this is sort of an insurance policy that, if you lose the species, at least you have some seeds. And the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden is really specializing in these two things with the seeds right now. They participate with the National Seed Storage Lab, so that for example, when I go collect seeds from Phacelia and give them to the bot garden, they test them for viability, they store them, and then they also send some to the larger offsite lab as well. So there's insurance if something were to happen in the bot garden. Hand pollination, tissue culture is a technique that we've been trying with one plant, and augmentation is just another fancy word for adding more plants to the existing populations so that those populations are bigger and perhaps more buffered against some kind of catastrophe that might happen there, like an erosion slump or something like that. At the habitat level, invasives control and habitat management that you guys help a lot with. at the landscape level, making new populations. So there's more out there, more connectedness, and animal eradication. And then of course, you don't know if it's worked or hasn't worked until you do some monitoring. So we have a fairly active monitoring program going on as well. So this is kind of how it all puts together. This is where it started, where my talk started out. And I hope it makes more sense to you now that you're seeing all these words on the screen that might make you think a little bit about when you see a population or a landscape, what is really going on here besides, oh, it's rare, or, oh, it's in bad shape. So just to highlight what we're working on right now, I'm working very intensively with a group of botanists from the Park Service, the Botanic Garden, the Fish and Wildlife Service, TNC, Catalina Island Conservancy, the Navy on Clemente and San Nicolas, and then also with some of our colleagues down in Baja. We've developed a consortium of botanists that we're sharing techniques, we're sharing ideas, and we're testing out ideas and letting folks know how it's going. So it's a really exciting time to be a botanist right now out on the Channel Islands, especially a rare plant one. And I'd just like to give a shout out to all of the funders and also some of the people who've been really with me for more than just a couple of years, but have worked with me for 5 to even to 10 years, some of these folks. And that concludes my story, but I really would be interested to hear what you think or what questions you have at this point.
Kathryn, we've received 17 really great questions.
Good.
So I will go through them as we receive them. Doesn't even seem like there's any duplicates here. Are there lessons from your work on the islands that provide insight about rare plants or ecological management more broadly on the mainland?
Yeah, I had an opportunity to work with the San Diego South County about 10 years ago. They have a conservation plan for about 41 different species down there. And a lot of their species are very similar to ours, our annuals. And so a lot of the work that I've learned from working with annuals on these islands is eminently transferable to the mainland, and things that they've been learning there are helping us as well. The other lesson, I guess, is just this whole idea of the constraints and how do you suss out what's the problem. And so I think that's exportable too to other parks and other land management places.
Okay, great. And how have native plants been affected by the introduction of grasses by ranchers? How do you manage non-native grasses given their current range? And of course, you talked about how ripgut brome affected Phacelia. And go ahead.
Yeah, that's a tough thing to manage because they're so ubiquitous. And some of them are not incipient infestations; they're here to stay. And so on islands, it's difficult because of logistics. But what has worked in some places is the use of fire to clear grass. There's a body of research on using fire up near Berkeley to clear grass in the Berkeley Hills so that some of the lupin scrub, for example, can come back, which would be a situation directly applicable to Carrington Point. Some people use herbicides to kill grasses, but if it's a very broad acres and acres of grass, that's not a very, very viable solution. Some places on the islands, since we've been monitoring through the transect monitoring program that the National Park Service has, that have thin soils, over time, the grasses, the non-native grasses that need thicker soils are actually disappearing and the shrubs are coming back in. And so one of the challenges is to see on the landscape, where would those places be that are ultimately going to probably revert to shrubs over decades. It took a while to get that way, so it's going to take a while to change back. And focus instead on these places that are really massively covered with grass.
Yeah, there's actually several questions about fire. We'll try not to be redundant, but that answered, I think, one or two.
Okay.
And just can't help but putting a plug in for animal grazing where appropriate. And it's animal grazing, of course, led us to problems on the Channel Islands, but here on the mainland, the mainland ecosystems, as you know, are adapted to grazers. And so we've used sheep, for instance, at the San Marcos foothills and Elings
Yeah.
Park for grazing purposes, just
Yeah,
like the threat.
yeah, I heard a really interesting talk at the California Invasive Plant Pest Council meeting a few years ago by a shepherdess, um, a, 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 a private company that actually has goats, and they will come and graze judiciously small areas to eat certain weeds. And it was fascinating to think about that the goat, they could show the goat the weed and say, this is the one to eat. They would usually show the maternal, the alpha mom, and she would teach the others. And then they would let them graze there for a while and then move them on. So I think it has a place. It certainly has a place in management.
Great. And then specifically, what is the mesh size and height of the fog screens?
The mesh size is 1 inch square, and they're made out of 12 gauge galvanized steel. They are about 30 inches tall and about 4 feet wide. We tried all kinds of sizes and shapes of these things, and we found that that works best for us on Santa Rosa Island, where the wind is just fierce. Anything bigger, they just blew away, tore up and blew over. So when you look at the literature and the knowledge that's been gained from our colleagues down in South America, it's clear from what they're doing and what they're saying is that if you're going to use fog screens, test them out, test out several different kinds of mesh, because what works best in one place may not work best in the other. What it depends on is how fast the wind is blowing, how consistently it's blowing, the particle size of the dust or whatever it is that's forming the thing that the fog particle actually hangs onto, and that varies over latitude and over many places. So try it out before you commit to a lot of money put into it.
Yeah, this is the kind of thing you're learning about and researching and finding, being able to provide to other people. Let's see. Yes, that's a duplicate. Okay, sorry about that. Let's see. So here's a couple of questions along these lines. Could fire be used as a recovery tool, as the Chumash did for thousands of years? And then somebody asked, did in fact they use fire management on the Channel Islands? And let's see, what was the final fire question? Where are you able to use fire in the Channel Islands? Which I thought was a good question too.
Yeah, these are all good questions. Chumash history is not my specialty, but from what I've learned from the conversations I've had and the papers that I've read is that it seems likely that the Chumash may have used fire on the islands, but in small areas, not just overwhelming, burn the whole island. They may have used it to clear patches, for example, for the diclostema, the blue dicks that they like to eat the bulbs of. But there's no evidence of very widespread and frequent use of fire. So it's hard to know, what to mimic, because we don't know, what it was like. A lot of times when we talk about restoration, we talk about restoring a landscape to something that it was before. And there are a couple of problems with that. One is for the Channel Islands, we're not sure what it was before. But the other is it's not clear that that's going to continue to function in this changed climate and other alterations that have happened. So I think thinking about fire as a tool, irregardless of how it was used before on the islands, is probably a good idea. And there may be small areas where it would be a useful tool. The problem on islands, of course, is just logistics. And that's something for the managers to decide if they want to engage in that. It's for me to say this might be a tool that would be useful, say, for example, for the Phacelia to help reduce the brome grass. But that's a management decision that needs to be made. And I don't know where where you could burn on an island very easily. I think it would be a big job, but it's possible, I suppose.
I know of at least 2 fires that have gotten out of control on Santa Cruz Island, right?
Yeah.
By people who are doing good work. Not us, not you. So back to baselines, which you just mentioned, this is a good question. How do you decide what baseline to restore to? For instance, the pre-ranching, pre-chew mash, etc. Given the lack of historical data that you just mentioned, this is, and this person really points out, this is who are we to decide type of conversation. That's a lot of people ask that.
Yeah.
Exactly those questions over and over again. I hear it.
Yeah, I hear that too. And I ask myself that sometimes. I think of restoration as more of recreation or creation of a situation in which, for my purposes, a rare plant that I'm concerned about can live. And my approach has been to study the plants and let them tell me, what's going on here, what's wrong, what do you need, and then restore to that function, or restore so that they can function, rather than trying to recreate a historic scene or something that we don't really know what it was in the past. Certainly, these are land management managers' decisions as well as, what do we restore to? And I think that given the extreme endemism and the incredible biodiversity and the rarity of our biota here on the islands, especially even more so than the mainland, the land management agencies have said we want to conserve the native rare plants and animals as one of our major goals. So I think what we need to be doing is to restore conditions in which those critters can function, rather than trying to fit some other model.
Okay. I noticed that one of the people that asked about burning mentioned that in some places up north where I'm from, he says, the introduced grasses do even better after fires, unfortunately. We'll just throw that out.
Yeah.
And then a lot of questions about bushmallow.
Oh.
So somebody was wondering what the white pearls in the cuttings are. I assume that's vermiculite. Is that bushmallow? Somebody really, I guess, was curious about that. Might mallows generate better if the seeds are exposed to smoke? So are they fire adapted on the islands?
Yeah.
Would be another way of putting that. And do you mix the plants of island bushmallow in the new areas from each of the original 6 populations?
Wow. Yeah, all good questions. Yeah, we do mix them. What we did initially was we collected seeds from each individual population and cut them open to see if they have embryos in them and were they viable. And it turns out there's such low viability that we figured there's something going on with seed production. And so then Dieter Wilken actually did a pollination experiment where he took pollen with a paintbrush from one and put it on the other. And when he did that, when he pollinated one plant with another one from the same population, he got about 20% seed set. And when he outcrossed them or used different populations, he got about 80%. So that said to us, that's one way we could actually improve seed production, would be to put plants in mixed plantings, mixed genotype plantings. And so we had a big discussion with Fish and Wildlife and land managers about that. And the consensus was, yeah, do that. So we do that now. Along the lines of does the plant require fire? That's a question we're working on right now with these seeds that we were able to collect last year. You'd think that they would, because their close cousins on the mainland do. And one population showed up on Santa Cruz Island after a prescribed burn. So, evidence that they probably do need fire. Whether or not that's the only way that they could get going is uncertain at this point. People who've studied fire ecology have started using, get seeds and germinate them in the presence of charate that they've made from burning leaves their own, and have also been using liquid smoke, a product you can buy at the grocery store. We're right now working on an experiment with the single island manzanita on Santa Rosa Island. And the jury's out because our plantings are new, but we took seeds and treated them with liquid smoke and with sandpaper and boiling water, about 6 or 7 different treatments. Hands down, the liquid smoke is working real well. So it may be that, you don't have to go burning stuff to get a chemical reaction that the plant needs, which would be much easier than burning. And it makes me wonder, when I eat liquid smoke, what the heck, what's it doing to me? Yeah. Yeah, a lot of these fire questions are really very interesting for the islands because there is a lot of evidence from other islands around the world that plants that live on islands that require fire or other ecosystem processes have relaxed that need for that in order to be on the island.
Yeah, there was a great study that a bunch of people did, and Mary Carroll and Linda Lauren
Yeah.
and you maybe, I don't know, every big bucket of great island folks who came to put out a paper saying that by and large island chaparral plants were not particularly fire adapted. The germination rate was not dramatically different if you used fire scarification or smoke or other such things to try to get them to break their dormancy.
Yeah. Yeah, and that certainly indicates that they evolved on islands that didn't have a lot of fire.
Right.
Sort of circumstantial. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, we'll go back to grasses and grazing in just a moment, but I like this one. What do you think about relocating a population of island scrub jays on Santa Rosa to help restoration efforts?
Yeah, there's a lot of debate about that right now as to how that could work. The story is that the island scrub jays eat or take acorns and fly around and put them in the ground, and they will cache thousands of acorns in individual scrub jay over a season, and then they forget where about a third of them are, and so those are effectively acorns that have been planted. And there's some evidence, not just from Santa Cruz Island, but from places where these types of birds have been studied, is that there's this very tight hand-holding interaction between the acorn producing plants and the birds that plant them. And so the thought is that Santa Rosa Island right now does not have scrub jays. It may have had scrub jays in the past, and so that perhaps the scrub jays could help plant acorns on Santa Rosa. The idea has merit. I mean, it makes sense, but I think right now Santa Rosa is not quite ready for that. The scrub jays need to put acorns in a place that has a seed bed, that layer of litter and soil that I was talking about. And I think we would need to look and see, are the conditions good enough right now that the scrub jays would actually be effective at planting. And then there's a little bit of debate too about how the scrub jays would interact with the other birds that are there. Scrub jays can prey on, I think, on seeds or on eggs of other birds. And so the bird communities are recovering, and how would that interaction work if the scrub jays were introduced? So I think a lot of folks are thinking it's a good idea, it has merit, but we need to really research the situation before committing to anything like that. And as a scientist in government, my job is to say, here's some of the questions, here's some ways we could figure this out. Let's do this research and figure out what would be some of the consequences. And then that would be information handed off to the managers, and they can then decide what they want to do.
Oh boy, we have a lot more here. I'm not sure we can get to all of them, actually. I don't know how much time you have. We don't want to take your whole evening, but these are our really cool questions.
Good.
I think they heard you when you said that they have a great gestalt. Couple questions about back to management of grasses. Have you ever used things like fusilade? That, of course, is a grass specific herbicide. And has anyone used herds of deer or elk to graze off areas? And I guess you already touched on that. But.
We have used fusilade out on Santa Rosa Island. There is one of these annual species, a slender flowered gilia that lives only on Santa Rosa, that has had its population boundaries encroached upon by a non-native false brome grass Brachypodium distachyium that originated in the areas around Israel. It's been showing up probably in the last couple of decades on some of the islands. Was detected on Santa Cruz, I think in the mid-90s perhaps. So when we found it on Santa Rosa through one of the transect monitoring plots that the Park Service was doing, we started to look because that was really close to the Gilia population, found it at the verges, and so used fusillade there to push it back and hopefully eradicate it. We thought we'd done a pretty good job, and then we had a lot of rain a couple of years ago, and we got more seed germination from that species, so we need to revisit that. That was a very small treatment in and near an endangered plant population, and so we went through about a year of consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service before we even approached putting anything out there. So some of these things are slow motion events when you talk about the government. Using deer and elk to manage vegetation. I'm not aware of anybody who's done that. I'm not sure if you can, I don't know, maybe some of you guys out there do, but I'm not aware of anybody using deer and elk to manage vegetation.
No, it might happen someplace, and certainly they do it naturally, of course.
Yeah.
Sure. But usually if you're using prescribed grazing, it's sheep, goats, or cattle.
It might be easier to convince a goat to do what you want it to do than it would be to convince an elk.
Let's see. Did the native, you said you weren't an expert on the Chumash, but did someone ask if Native Americans prior to European contact affect the island plants much?
Oh, they had to have. I mean, they were there for thousands of years. A lot of the archaeology work that's been done is focused on the marine interactions. I think for good reason. I mean, that probably was a major source of their sustenance, but also I think because some of those marine sites are subject to erosion, and if you don't study them now, they're not going to be there to study later. But there are a handful of archaeologists now who've been looking more in the interior of the islands and have been finding hearths with, for example, the bulbs of the blue dicks that are really have a lot of starch and protein in them that apparently were used quite heavily, and perhaps cultivated in some way. And also, interestingly, one of our really, really rare plants, island barberry, has been found in a couple of hearth remains. So I'm sure that they did interact with the island plants. It's not clear yet because of the lack of inland research of exactly what that was, but it's being actively looked at right now.
Okay. I don't think we can get to everybody's questions tonight, I'm afraid, and I'm taking them in the order they were received and trying to group them and be creative here. But yeah, these are all cool, Kathryn. So if you have a little more time, over the course of your time on the islands, have there been social/political road bumps that have made your work more challenging, or has there largely been support for this work? I think back, this wasn't your job, but I think back to the controversy of removing pigs and rats and animals. That was very controversial, but.
Yeah, those were more management actions that I was not directly involved in deciding. My job is to study what happens when you do those actions. There, of course, when you change management or change land use, there's going to be a period of sort of trying to adjust to the new norm, trying to make a new norm. And most of my time here has been going through that transition. And so I tend to think of it more as a transition rather than a whole bunch of hurdles that somebody had to get over. And to me, part of the fascinating debate that goes along with this kind of change is, what are some of the upsides and downsides of moving from one system of land management to another? And as a scientist, how do you study that? How do you understand it? Or how do you capture the information as a baseline so that somebody can look back 100 years from now and know how it was and see what some of the consequences of those decisions were? And that study that you were involved in, Ken, back in 2002, we were establishing a baseline for Santa Cruz Island. We put releve plots, 10 meter by 40 meter plots all over the island, and we looked to see what the vegetation was in there. because that was the time the pigs were being removed, kind of like ground zero for animal removal. And so it sets the stage for us to understand better what the consequences of those actions are. And I find that extremely interesting, really. So I'm kind of glad that I'm working here in a time when things are changing management wise, because it gives you something to study.
Great. Thank you. Great questions here, folks. I'll just take us real quickly back to bush mallows. A lot of bush mallow questions.
Wow, cool.
Do they have pollinators for the mallows? Out on the islands? And is bush mallow population by the Santa Cruz Island Reserve Station one of the planted or natural populations? I think that one was planted, isn't it?
There's a natural one there, and there's several planted ones. Yeah, there's a natural one that has been known about probably since Mary Carroll was working on it, probably since the 1980s at least. It's pretty close to the fuel station in a cliffy area.
Oh yeah,
and then
right.
we've planted a bunch of them between the UC Reserve fuel station and Lindell's, the director's house in that area. Because we wanted to have some nearby that we could watch and check on fairly quickly. There are pollinators for mallows on the island, on Santa Cruz Island. The family, the Malvaceae family that this plant is in, has a very specialized kind of floral arrangement, and it takes specialized pollinators for that plant, for that family. So Robin Thorpe, who has worked on the islands for years, an entomologist, says he very rarely sees a pollinator for the Malvaceae out there, but he has found them, so they're there.
Okay, and then a couple of questions about how do people, you gotta be careful when you ask this question, folks. How do people get careers doing this? I asked that question to Steve Junak once, and he took me seriously, and I started at CIR.
Yeah.
So, and then, or more generically, how can we help? And of course, I asked that question of Kathryn a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not an easy kind of job to get, but it might be easier now than it was a few years ago. It's abundantly clear to me that I would not have the job I have now if I did not have a PhD degree. That was kind of like, you got to get that in order to be able to be a government scientist running kind of your own program. That's not to say a PhD degree helps you do that, but that seems to be a bar to hit. One of the things, though, that I think really helps, especially if you're like a young person in school, is to get as much internship experience or field experience as you can, applying what you're learning. And not only just going out and helping, like pull weeds and dig holes, but actually writing grant proposals, writing reports, doing an internship that gives you an opportunity to have a little tiny project of your own that you own and design and do. Even as an undergraduate, that can be hugely beneficial. And the Park Service and the Department of Interior in general has a volunteer program that provides job descriptions. And so I've had several people who are high school kids or college kids come back to me and say, I'm going to put you in as a reference for this job that I did with you, for a couple of summers out on Santa Rosa helping with the cloud forest. And I've actually had people from colleges call me, and say, did this really happen? And, had this person do. So some of those types of volunteer experiences, even if they're unpaid, can help your resume, can build a resume. So getting an education and applying the education in a demonstrable way as an intern or volunteer, I think is really huge.
Yeah, I preach that mantra to young kids all the time, just because, I volunteered with people like you and ended up moving to a career,
Yeah.
Which is amazing. And so I just, volunteerism, yeah, Okay, let's see if we can, this one's a little technical. Which plants are you using to tissue culture to propagate? Using tissue culture to propagate?
Yeah, this is an expensive thing to do, so we don't do this very much, and we do it as kind of a last ditch effort. But there is a particular long-lived shrub that is called island barberry, has relatives, close relatives on the mainland. Barberries in general are kind of rare all over the world where they occur. But this plant, unlike the Santa Cruz Island bush mallow, it just does not want to grow. We've taken cuttings and it won't make roots, or it will start to make roots and then will die back. We'll repot it, put it in different soils, and it'll just persist but not grow. So it's not a plant that's easy to work with like the bush mallow is to get young ones to plant out. It also, like the bush mallow, has issues with making fertile seeds, and so seeds are not abundant. They're not always viable. Cuttings don't work, and so we've started exploring tissue culture with that one. And that's a really highly specialized thing to do. The Huntington Garden has been helping us with that right now.
Great place to visit, by the way, if you're in Pasadena area.
Yeah.
Okay, got a little more time, Kathryn? We're about a quarter after. Okay, thanks. Because they keep coming. Actually, please, we have enough now, though. And maybe she'll just answer your question. I have to answer Erin's question. It's a little off topic for you, but she's a faithful employee. Great conservationist. Are there endemic lichens? I know there are. I know lichens are doing much better on the islands because of air quality. She says, also, are there any endemic fungi out there? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, that is a really understudied bunch of organisms, lichens and fungi in general. But there are some endemic lichens that have been identified.
I'm sorry, Kathryn. Just let me bundle one other with it. Has there been any research done looking at and then restoring fungus in the soil? So that's a great Michael O'Reilly type question. So,
yeah. So far we've not done a lot of that, but for the Cloud Forest project, we have started looking at the use of, trying to identify whether or not we could use fungi to help us to develop soil crusts. And this kind of goes back to your first set of questions about, are there endemic fungi or endemic lichens? What do we know about them? And the answer is we don't know much. So if there's anybody out there who wants to do a master's degree or a PhD degree or a research project looking at those things, it's wide open right now. There is one lichenologist who spent a fair amount of time out on the islands, Carrie Knudsen, who found a lichen on one of the oak trees that he named for Sarah Cheney, who was a botanist here for years, on one of those island oaks. So that's an endemic lichen that we know about. There really is not much known about them right now.
Yeah, I remember a lichenologist telling me that I had a picture of an endemic Rotella, which is a genus of lichen. It's the only genus of lichen I know now. Okay, let's move on. What, if any, challenges do island plants face due to insect species? So I guess that's a pest question.
Every now and then there have been outbreaks of caterpillars, and this is another area that I'm not really expert on as to what the names of these creatures are, that have almost decimated some of the scrub oaks and manzanitas. And they seem to be episodic outbreaks related to, I'm not sure what, perhaps weather, perhaps the age of the organisms in the soil. But I'm not really, right now, I'm drawing a blank on any major insect pest problems that we've had. But
how about bark beetles?
Yeah, bark beetles could be an example. On Santa Cruz Island in particular, there was a big dieback of bishop pines over the last decade, and probably the real crux of the problem for the pines is not the beetle, but it's the drought and the fact that the trees have been weakened by drought. And then the beetle can, that's usually always there, can have a more devastating effect on the tree. The beetle actually is not the vector that kills the tree, but it's a fungus that comes along with the beetle. When the beetle burrows into the bark, the fungus actually infects the tree and the tree dies or declines. But when I think about insects on the islands, I think the bigger problem is the lack of pollinators in some places for some species. So the kind of the flip side of the pest problem.
Not enough insects. Okay, we only have a couple left here. First off, a shout out to Epco who's watching. Yay, Lisa.
Hey,
She says she says hi and yay,
Right.
and several people have thanked you and cheered you on.
Thank you. It's great.
So yeah, it's really great. So yeah, this gives you a chance to talk about the cloud forest again. On the island oak with roots above ground, could you use the erosion control around the roots and fill it with soil and add a screen cover so the soil won't get blown away? So we've done everything but a screen cover. It's mostly burlap, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, and wattles and all that.
Yeah. Did you say screen?
Yes. Yeah. A screen cover.
Yeah.
To keep it from blowing away.
Yeah. We have a colleague, Clark Cowan, who works on the islands, who's an arborist, and he tells me that the root spread of a tree is almost as big as its crown, plus about a third more around the tree. And so looking at those island oaks and the barrenness around them makes me actually visualize them as even a bigger zone that needs help than just where the canopy is. And so one of the things that we've done for one of the groves is to put down eucalyptus chip mulch and then cover that with coconut fiber matting. And then plant stuff into that. So hopefully the plants will hold the matting down over the years. Another experiment that we've got going on with one of the stands of oaks is looking at the microbes that are in the bedrock and then looking to see how the diversity and just numbers of different kinds of microbes change when we put matting on top of it. So we're in the middle of that experiment right now. But the amazing thing about that bedrock is that it holds a lot of moisture within the crystalline structure and small micro cracks within the bedrock. And if you pick up a piece of it and hold it up and look, you can see fungal hyphae dangling down from the bottom of the rock. And so one of my USGS colleagues who studies soil physics came out with me and we collected some rocks and she took them back and put them in under a scanning electron microscope. And they are absolutely covered with fungal colony or bacterial colonies and mycorrhizae, almost 100%. So really that rock, even though it looks barren, is a living organism, a living crust. And I think what you're suggesting of putting any kind of cover on that to help protect that crust is going to help the roots of those trees and help the whole system. So yeah, the more we can do that, the better we'll be. And I think covering it, yeah, you have to cover it or it'll all blow away.
Okay. Just while we still have a lot of folks on the webinar, I want to remind everyone this webinar is going to be available on the CIR webpage in a few days. A couple of days or so is usually our turnaround time on it. You can find that at cirweb.org /webinars. Try to make it simple. I'll put that in the chat again in just a moment. But let's see. These are do you need volunteer tissue culturists? Another volunteer question.
Volunteer tissue culturalists. Yeah. It's a pretty specialized thing to do. But if you've got...
It's Andrea. Do you know Andrea?
Andrew?
Andrea Adams Morton. She's with CNPS, Channel Islands chapter.
Yeah. Yeah. Send me an email. It's painstaking and time consuming and expensive, but yeah, if somebody wants to volunteer to help, we can sure try and figure out ways to make that work. Right now, aside from the work with the Berberis, there are no other species that come to mind readily that need that right now. So, but we can sure talk about it.
What about allelopathic effects of eucalyptus parts?
Yeah.
Are
Yeah,
you worried about it?
Yeah, we were. We were concerned about that because it certainly has the reputation for being allelopathic. And so we did two things. We aged the bark chips for a year before we took them up there. But the other thing is that we made some small plots and planted buckwheat into them to see, if it would have some kind of deleterious effect on the buckwheat, which, is a really easy to germinate plant. And there was no loss of buckwheat that way. And we also looked at the literature, and it's pretty clear from the literature that the oils that are potentially allelopathic are in the leaves. And so we had taken and chipped up, big chunks of wood and had purposefully left the leaves out of what we put up there as mulch. And it seems to be working pretty well. But yeah, we were worried about that. We checked on that. And it's a good thing to do, to check on it.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. A lot of congratulations keep coming in, and cheers and thanks to us all, particularly to you, but people saying it's nice to see me. It's been a while since I've been out personally, and it's great to see all these familiar names.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little, some of the last two questions are either too cryptic or too long. I can't get to them for now, but thank you so much, Kathryn, for that excellent, wonderful presentation and all your fabulous work.
Thank you. Yeah, my pleasure. I always enjoy question and answer sessions because it's great to connect with folks. And it's really weird to give a talk and not be able to see anybody. So hi and bye. Yeah. And hopefully we won't have COVID going on forever, and you guys can get back out, help with Cloud Forest and other projects.
Well, we'd love it. When I say we, I'm talking about all 100 of us. Yeah. Yeah, and that's a small representative amount of people that would jump at that chance, as you know.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Kathryn, and thank you, Maury Spellman, our marketing manager, for helping put all this together tonight.
Yeah.
How do we contact you, Kathryn? Can you put that in the chat, your email address?
Yeah, I sure can. I think I can. Sure, I'll do that.
I mean, or Maury, if you have it handy, it's in our contacts. But again, folks, this is an ongoing webinar series. We do them on the last or the fourth week of the month. Usually on Thursdays. We moved it today to accommodate island schedule. In other words, she couldn't make it yesterday.
Yeah, I was worried I'd get stuck on Santa Rosa Island, and in fact I did. So thanks for moving it. Yeah, the weather this time of year is iffy. Yeah.
Okay, so Kathryn _ McEachern, which is MC C. Oh, I'm sorry. Bad eyes. MCEACHERN at usgs.gov.
Yep,
So
that's me.
In the chat there. Yeah, thanks again, everyone, and join us again.
Yeah,
again, next month we'll be hearing from the Santa Monica Mountains Trails Council and from CIR and everybody here. Thanks for joining us. It's always a pleasure. Bye. Thank you, Kathryn. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.